and welcome once again to yet another session of Who's Who in the Bible, praying with biblical characters. Yesterday, we looked at the story of Cain and Abel, and today, we move on to Noah. I'd like to begin with a story for a change. Story is told of a man who had a tremendous experience in his life, a particular experience. And every time, whenever he went for a gathering, an assembly, a party, he always wanted to tell his story because it had impacted him so much. Finally, when he died and he went to heaven and St. Peter welcomed him and he said, I would like to address the people here about a tremendous experience that I had. So St. Peter said, well, that's fine. Just before he was going to begin, St. Peter asked him, now what's your story all about? He said, I want to talk about an experience of flood that I had. Peter said, all very well, but just remember, Noah is here as well. Well, this is just a funny story. It's not true, but the story tells us an important truth, that the flood has been a major experience across cultures, across peoples. But today we are going to look at a flood story from the point of view of Noah. Now, what do we know of Noah? That's important for us too. And for that, we need to turn to the Bible. I'd like to read to you from Genesis chapter 6. Verse 6 onwards. The Lord regretted having created humankind on the earth, and his heart grieved. He said, I will destroy man whom I created and blot him out from the face of the earth, as well as the beasts, creeping creatures, and birds, for I am sorry I made them. But Noah was pleasing to God. Verse 9 continues, this is the story of Noah. Noah was a just man, blameless among the people of his time, a man who walked with God. What a wonderful way to describe the biblical character that we are going to explore today, that we are going to reflect on today, and that we are going to pray with this biblical character. Now, we have learned many stories, heard many stories about Noah in our growing up years. You can get two extremes. You get one extreme where as children, we remember this great story of this big boat and the animals went there. We have wallpapers with the floating zoo, as it were. On the other hand, we have this terrible sounding God who comes now and destroys and wipes out the face of the earth with a flood. What is the story of Noah? Well, those of you who want to explore fully, we need to turn to Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 down to chapter 9, verse 17. Some of you might have even seen the film Noah, made in the year 2014 by Darren Aronofsky. What we have are different people trying to tell the story of Noah. But of course, the best way is to read the story of Noah and the flood directly from the scriptures. It's from chapter 6, verse 5 until chapter 9, verse 17. Let me quickly take you through the main aspects of this story. We see that there is a lack of harmony. That's beginning from the early chapters. In chapter 3, we saw the sin of disobedience of Adam and Eve. Now this circle of sin gets wider because in chapter 4, we have the murder of Abel by his own brother Cain. And this evil keeps getting bigger and bigger until we come to a point where we heard in today's reading, it grieved the heart of God to see how things had turned out so badly. And he therefore had to respond to this situation. And that's the background to the flood that we're going to hear. because this circle of sin just got wider and wider. And God, in that situation, picks out Noah with all those wonderful qualities that I just read for you. But just imagine this wonderful story. Noah, in the midst of land, the nearest sea body would have been 100 miles away, and he's building a boat, while the rest of them continue as though nothing has happened. They must have thought he's crazy. And finally the rains came. It went on, and then the ark with all the 8 members of the family and the animals are in it. He's in a kind of what you would call quarantine, because he just cannot move out of that ark. Until finally the waters begin to recede, and then he sends first a raven, doesn't come back, then he sends a dove, and it comes back with an olive branch. And we are given an important phrase when the water begins to recede. It says, God remembered Noah. That's a turning point in the story. And finally, when they step off the land, onto the land, Noah makes an altar, offers sacrifices, and he's given the very same command that Adam received: be fruitful and multiply. God makes a covenant with Noah, and then the life continues. These would have been stories that were told around the fire as the groups, the tribes got together. And finally, they put together a story. And that's why you find sometimes in this story some details that don't seem to coincide. The number of days of rain, the number of animals taken onto the ark, because this is a story coming from different traditions, finally woven into the one story that we have from these chapters that I just mentioned, chapter 6 to chapter 9. Now, it is important for us, having listened to the story, to ask ourselves, what literature, what literary form are we looking at? Because it is understanding the literary form that we begin to properly interpret what the story is about. And because you have people asking, is this really a scientific description? The aim of this story is not a journalistic record. The aim of this story is not a journalistic record. The aim of this story is to tell us how God saves. We believe, as Catholics, that God has created the world, God has created reason. And science is the study of God's creation with the help of reason that God has given to humanity. And so the Bible does not claim to be a science textbook describing how floods come about. Hence, as Catholics, we are not obliged to interpret every text in a literal or a fundamental way. And that is why small little groups like sects and denominations tie themselves in knots trying to describe and take this so literally, when that was not the intent of the writer. They want to serve, these members of these sects and these denominations, they want to serve as God's defense lawyers, going against the very reason and logic that God has blessed our human minds with, because they miss the intent of the story. Because the material and the literature that we have in Genesis chapter 1 to 11, we must understand that they are stories of life experience told to us in poetic form. As I have said on an earlier occasion, quoting Cardinal Bea, the Bible was written to tell us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go, not the functioning of the planets, not these aspects, because it is not so much interested in these sections of the Bible, Genesis 1 to 11. It's not interested in a journalistic history, but a salvation history, a theological history. The writers of this sacred story naturally would be writing from their own experience. Some locate this between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers near Mesopotamia, which is in today's Iraq. And the question that is asked of this story is not how much water was there, what are the names of the animals, but the relationship between God, between humanity, and between creation. And how, when sin enters into this relationship, there are consequences of the sin. That is the aim of the story. So let us not expect from this story what is not the intention of the author. We all know from different traditions of cultures, of other faiths, that the flood story is also found in other parts of the world, including the area of Mesopotamia. And so some people will say, wow, this is no great story. You also get similar stories like the others. Sure enough. But what we are having here in this story is not a cut and paste job. The stories might have similar elements. As one of the scholars says, the skeleton might be the same, but the flesh and the animating spirit are totally different. Because this story is not just about destruction, but this story is also about God's mercy and God's merciful intention, that His mercy and His care exceeds the disaster that is expressed over here. I'd like to introduce a word that some of you might be familiar with, and that's called it comes from the Greek, Anthropomorphism. It comes from two Greek words, anthropos and morphos. Anthropos means man, and morph is the form. So in this text, we see God taking on a human form as a matter of telling the story. So we are told that the heart of God was grieved at the sin in the heart of humanity. You know, we are told that God regrets, God is pained, God remembers. In very human form, this story tells us something about God. Now, you must understand that the Greeks had a different notion of God. They thought of God as the unmoved mover, that almost inanimate being. But for the Hebrews, as one of the scholars, Rabbi Heschel, says, God is the most moved mover. God feels along with His people. And that's why the kind of language that we have over here. Which brings me to the next point, which is an important text in Genesis chapter 8, verse 1. God remembered Noah. That's an important verb. There are few instances where we are told that God remembered. So, for example, in chapter 8, verse 1, we are told that God remembered Noah. In chapter 19, verse 29, we are told that God remembered Abraham. In chapter 30, verse 22, we are told that God remembered Rachel. Now, to remember in the Bible, and for God to remember, it's not just a recalling to mind. It is God being present, God acting, God intervening. Do you remember that the good thief on the cross at the side of Jesus says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom? And Jesus says, today. For God to remember is for God to act. And so the turning point of the story is that God remembered Noah. That's a very powerful verb that we remember because it comes to us later on also in the Eucharist. When God says, do this in remembrance of me, God is inviting us to act out, to live out the Eucharist. I'd like to move to another theme that comes to us in the Noah story, and that is the story of the covenant. Now, it's interesting that the language berith in Hebrew is applied to the covenant here. People tend to speak of the covenant with Adam, but it's by implication. That word does not appear. But here with Noah, the covenant is not made just with Noah or with Noah's family, but with all living creatures. It extends through the whole earth, planet Earth. And the covenant is God's way of indicating to us that His mercy wins over everything. And this is captured by Isaiah in his text, and I'd like to read it for you, chapter 54, verses 9 and 10. This, Isaiah is saying this is for me like Noah's waters, when I swore that they would no more flood the earth. So now I swear not to be angry with you and never again to rebuke you. The mountains may depart, the hills be moved, but never will my love depart from you, nor my covenant of peace be removed, says the Lord, whose compassion is for you. So this covenant that God makes with Noah is recalled later on by Isaiah. This covenant is a reminder of God's love, of God's mercy and compassion. Having looked at what it means for God to remember, having looked at this whole experience of the covenant, I want to move now to yet another symbol, that of the ark. The ark is a symbol of God's grace. The ark is a symbol of God's care. You know, right through what we have seen so far in the scriptures as we've been exploring the characters, even when there was judgment, God never failed to show His mercy. As the Psalms remind us, justice and mercy have kissed, they have embraced. So even as judgment was passed on Adam and Eve, God sewed for them clothes of fig leaves. God was their tailor. Even when Cain was being hounded because of the evil that he had done, God assures him His protection. And here, even in the midst of the flood, God, through the ark, reminds Noah of His mercy. And so the ark for us is a reminder of God's care and concern. God continues to show that even today, and it is something that we need to look at, because we will look at it towards the end, because God never, ever abandons us. I'd like to lead you on to the next element, and that is of the rainbow. The rainbow is a sign of the covenant. Now, scholars point out that in the ancient traditions, very often God is, in that religious traditions, God is seen as with the bow and the arrow. So the use of this symbol is to say that God is laying down His bow. And that bow, instead of being a symbol of war, becomes a symbol of God's constant grace that has come to us through the covenant that He made with Noah. The Noah story also raises another question for us, and that is our care for creation. We speak very often about personal sin, and that's important. We speak sometimes about social sin, of all the discrimination, injustice, and the oppression that takes place in society and in the structures of society. And now we become conscious of yet another area of sin that we need to be aware of, and that is the sin against nature, environment, and ecology. And Pope Francis has been in the forefront reminding us that we are here merely as stewards of God's resources. And when we abuse these resources, we sin against God and the creation, as well as the generations that come afterwards. And in his writing, Laudato Si, he expresses this ever so clearly, something worthwhile reading. Because what happens is, when we plunder the earth and the resources of the earth, we suffer its consequences. When there is the melting of the snow caps, we are going to have an increased floods. And these floods are not the act of God, they are the act of humanity that has failed to take God's creation seriously. We suffer, as they say, not only because of our sin, but also through our sin of how we fail to take care of the universe and of God's creation. Having looked at all these different dimensions, I need to see the connection that we have between this Noah story and what we have in the New Testament. In fact, Jesus quotes precisely this experience. And I'd like to read for you because it comes to us both in the Matthew's Gospel, chapter 24, verses 37 to 38, and Luke's Gospel, chapter 17, verses 26 to 27. In summing it up, just as it was in the days of Noah, so too it will be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. This is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. In other words, Jesus is comparing Noah's flood with the last day of judgment. Now, in the early church, it's interesting that the flood was also interpreted as a prefiguring of baptism. In the first letter of St. Peter, we are told precisely that in first letter of Peter, chapter 3, verses 20 to 21. Yet another symbol that is used in the New Testament is when we see the dove. Because the dove, which comes back to Noah with the olive branch, we see it appearing at the baptism of Jesus, where Jesus is standing in the water. And as he's being baptized by John the Baptist, the dove appears on top, which is a reminder not only of the waters which are now become the waters of cleansing and of baptism, but also a symbol of a new creation that happens, that is inaugurated with Jesus. We see in this Noah story also echoes of the early story of creation in this very book of Genesis. What was good, God saw very good, has now become evil. Where there was a separation of waters in the first chapter, now we see that waters are no longer separated. The same command that was given, be fruitful and multiply, is given 3 times here in this Noah story. And so Noah appears like the Adam figure. Just one more element I want to bring to you with regard to Noah. Noah, towards the end of the story, was told that he was drunk, and because of his drunkenness, he exposed himself in nakedness. Now, the sin that is being attacked is the abuse of alcohol that results in such kind of behavior. Abuse leads to the sin. You might say it's shocking, because after all the good things said about Noah, he was just, he was blameless, God remembered him, and yet as a righteous man, he fell. The point is, even good people sometimes fall, but God's grace lifts them up. So what does the Noah story have to say to you and to me? I'd like us to close our eyes as I gently lead you into this praying with this biblical character, Noah. The Noah story is a story of death and life. The Noah story is a story of sin and redemption. The Noah story can very well be our story. And the God of the covenant who came into the life of Noah comes into our life. And just as the ark was a protection for Noah, so also God wishes to protect us. How do we experience this protection of God? It comes to us in different ways. Do we always recognize it? It comes to us in the sacraments. The sacrament of the Eucharist, the sacrament of confession. It comes to us through our faith community, through the church. It comes through us through people whom God sends into our lives. Our family, our friends, our guides, our mentors. And God sends reminders of His love like the rainbow, signs of His covenant even today. And Jesus Himself is a great sign and a reminder of God's covenant for us. The Noah story tells us that God remembered Noah. The good news is God remembers you. God remembers me. God remembers even when we were in our mother's womb. And even now, as we journey and sometimes struggle through life. Noah's story can also be our story. And God holds our hands. And God's protection is with us. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Thank you, dear friends, for joining us for yet another session of Who's Who in the Bible. And today we prayed about the biblical character Noah. Spread the word around. Introduce others who are not familiar with this, so that more and more of us will experience the richness of the Bible that comes to us through these biblical characters. Thank you once again for joining us. Good night, and God bless you all.